svi dobrodošli u Buksu. Prvo hvala Larsu Svensenu što je došao, hvala Team Pressu što je organizirao event, hvala Buksi koja nas je primila i hvala gospodinu Blankenborgu. Thank you for Mr. Blankenborg. On je veleposlanik Norveške u Republici Hrvatskoj. Tako da evo imamo i visoke uzvanike i vas, dragi gosti. Drago mi da ste došli. Tu je i naš prevoditelj Mišo Drundler s kojim ćemo isto malo kasnije razgovarati. A Lars Svendsen, možda ga i ne treba baš posebno i detaljno predstavljati, sam će se predstaviti tijekom ovog razgovora. On je autor koji je već dobro poznat našoj publici i brojne njegove knjige objavila izdavačka kuća Team Press. Bavio se kao filozof, bavi se zapravo nekakvim temeljnim idejama današnjice, slobodom, radom, laži, dosadom, bavio se strahom, modom, brojnim fenomenima današnjeg vremena na vrlo naizgled pitak, kompleksan, ali i pametan način, zapravo privlačan širokoj publici, preveden na brojne jezike, pa i kod nas vrlo čitan autor. Knjige možete i poslije i kupiti, možemo ih i potpisati. Ja ću ostaviti vremena kasnije, naravno, ukoliko budete željeli se i sami malo družiti s Larsom. Lars, sorry for this introduction on creation language. It was easier to explain a little bit about your books and about you in short way. I said all nice things.
Glad to hear.
And welcome to Zagreb. Nice to meet you again. It is now 4th time in Croatia.
Yes.
Yeah? And what do you think about Croatia now, 4th time?
I wouldn't have returned if I didn't like it, would I? So I clearly like it, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we can start not with books, but with those past 2 years, pandemic years.
Yeah.
We all know what happened during last 2 years, but what was good, what was the best what was happening during pandemic?
Well, I guess I discovered my inner introvert. Those 2 years, they were strange, but perhaps Norwegians are especially well equipped to deal with such situations. It was a very common joke in Norway that when the regulations for 2-meter distancing between people ended, everybody had a sigh of relief because that meant that we could return to our normal 5 meters. We tend to like our distance. Of course, it was a very strange time, and I also referred to 3 of my books, the one on boredom, the one on fear, and the one on loneliness, as my COVID trilogy, because all 3 topics really became actualized during this time. So, in my own case, well, a book on lying came out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I've heard you speaking on Zoom conversation about loneliness, about all those topics.
Yeah.
Suddenly you became the top philosopher of the moment. Yeah, how do you felt about this?
No, it's funny. You write something and all of a sudden it becomes more relevant. But whenever I write a book, I try to write about something that matters to people. Sometimes it matters more and sometimes it matters less. And of course, when such a situation as this pandemic occurs, to some extent, we lose our footing in the world and we need to reorientate ourselves. And I think that's really the task of philosophy, to contribute to our orientation in thinking, trying to find some way of going about, trying to find some sort of grasp of this situation we're all of a sudden in. And if my books can do that, of course, I'm really happy with that.
How did you personally spend your time during the COVID, during the pandemic? How did you organize your day and the work discipline and your thinking and writings?
Well, I must admit, not that much changed in my own case. I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I sleep late, get up, drink coffee, and then I write. So in my case, it was actually quite similar. Of course, the biggest change was, of course, that my wife and daughter was also at home. So, but I mean, it was a strange time because it provided a lot of material that we should think about. Also, doing philosophy, for instance. The power of governments to regulate our zones of freedom suddenly became very clear to us. that we may not notice in more normal times, and then we need to reflect on what is legitimate, what is not, and so on. So I actually think that this pandemic, it should have provided a blast of new philosophy, but unfortunately didn't quite did it.
But actually it was also a sort of happiness when someone was talking about us, you know, like they would care about us, and you know, people felt a little bit secure because of this.
Yeah.
So the role of the state suddenly became something that we are aware of.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, the fundamental job of any state is to provide some sort of protection for the citizens. So that role also became very clear to us. But of course, social relations changed a lot also during this time. And I think it's quite interesting that, for instance, when we talk about loneliness, we saw that during the first wave of lockdowns, loneliness actually decreased. Loneliness levels went down in most countries. And that was probably because people got to spend more time with other people they care about. Then as the situation dragged on and we got lockdown wave number 2, 3 and 4, the numbers started to rise again, and we all assumed that they will return to normal now pretty soon. But of course it also demonstrated something to us about the importance of others in our lives, that we are not self-sufficient, that we need others, that our lives are intertwined with those of others.
Yeah, actually, that was what I was also thinking about, those kind of individuality, like we are unique, one of a kind, we are raised like to be special, not care what other people think about us, and to be really unique in this world. And then suddenly, some other people are much more important than we. This word collectivity or collective suddenly became like the most important thing. And the word responsibility was in every media, in every article.
Yeah.
So we start to think about what is responsibility. Are we really responsible for anything?
Yeah, and of course, also it highlighted to some extent what we owe each other. That we owe each other certain things. That we have these obligations. That we have these responsibilities towards each other, and. I mean, in the individualization, that very process, there are many great things to say about that. For instance, we find that levels of trust are consistently higher in more individualized societies, because in more individualized societies, you also have to learn to trust strangers, not only the people you have in your immediate surroundings. But, of course, also in that process of individualization, we can also run the risk of losing sight of the fact that we can only realize these social projects together. That we actually have to draw in the same direction if we are to pull these things off.
I would like to speak a little bit about your book of loneliness. Actually, you mentioned that it suddenly became the top book, the top topic, and we all thought about. Suddenly we started to feel really how we feel being alone.
Yeah.
So it was like the new perspective of ourselves, being alone with us all day, and all those things about thinking about ourselves. Where are we? What are we doing? Are we lying to ourselves? Who we are? Yeah. Suddenly it became very important.
Yeah, loneliness is one of the fundamental features of human existence. I mean, and it has to do with the fact that from the very moment we're born, from even before we're born, our lives are intertwined with those of others. On the other hand, we have this urge for also separateness. And I think Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, has this great expression when he writes about man's unsocial sociability, that we have this ambivalence in us, that we both need belonging, but we also need separateness. And of course, the pandemic highlighted our need for belonging, because it demonstrated how we ended up when we all became so separate. But of course, a large, I mean, that book on loneliness was a really interesting book to write because, as I point out at the very beginning, it was fascinating when I started doing proper research that almost everything I thought I knew about loneliness turned out to be completely wrong. I thought, for instance, that Norway, way up north, those distant people, I thought we were lonely, probably the least lonely population on Earth. And I thought that loneliness levels had risen over the last few decades. They haven't. They have been very, very stable. There is absolutely no epidemic of loneliness going on. It rose during the later part of the pandemic, but we expect that it will return. And it was also very interesting to see that actually loneliness levels are lower in more individualized societies than in more collectivistic societies. I mean, we up north, we tend to look down south in Europe, we see those warm communities, but actually loneliness levels are much higher there than up north, which is perhaps a bit surprising to many. And and the main reason is probably because we have the world's highest trust levels. And when the World Values Survey are presented, Norwegian newspapers typically have headlines such as "Norwegians, the most naive population on Earth." And we probably are. There's a Russian saying that if you can't fool a Norwegian, you can't fool anyone, which is probably correct. But then again, that naivety is one of our great resources, because it makes for a really well-functioning, efficient society. So I think it's a greater natural resource than our oil. Yeah.
And what for? Can you explain a little bit those tools for measuring? How you measure loneliness? How you research it actually during the process of writing?
It's quite difficult to measure.
It's a bit fluid.
Yeah.
What I think about it and what do you think about it? Maybe it's not the same thing.
It's difficult to measure loneliness because it is a subjective phenomenon. It is ultimately a feeling. That's what differentiates being lonely from being alone. It's a feeling of pain or discomfort due to the perception that you are not sufficiently attached or connected to others. So the most obvious way of measuring loneliness is to ask people, do you feel lonely? To what extent, how often, and so on. And that's really imprecise. But if you ask the questions in the same way over time and to different populations, you can compare. So you can say something about development. But I think studies that say that exactly 24.7% of the population is lonely. I mean, that's nonsense. The answer is way too precise. You cannot measure it that precisely. I should also mention that there is a test for solitude, for sort of positive loneliness. And when I did this project, I ran these tests on myself. And in terms of the bad loneliness, I was really average, completely uninteresting. But as for solitude, the positive one, I was off the charts. I clearly get along perfectly with just my own company. That's probably typical of philosophers. But I also did another quite unusual thing for philosophers when I did this study. That is, Norwegians were probably the most thoroughly researched population on Earth. There are numbers for everything. I mean, Norway is every social scientist's wet dream. Really, you can find numbers for anything. And what I did, I got the raw data from our National Statistics Bureau, and I crunched data and did the statistics and so on. And that's very unusual for a philosopher to be that empirical, but it was really helpful because it clearly demonstrated to me that everything I thought I knew about loneliness was completely wrong.
But you mentioned loneliness and solitude and the positive loneliness. Can you explain a little bit the differences? And you describe it actually in the book, but can you explain?
Well, I'd say the main difference between solitude and loneliness is what sort of relation do you have to yourself in that condition? Are you living without the company of others, or are you in your own company? It's essentially about being self-reliant to some extent, of finding sources in yourself to go about your doings. And it's my impression that we're getting increasingly less capable of doing that. And I mentioned also this study in my book of this psychological experiment in which people are asked to sit alone in a room doing absolutely nothing for 15 minutes. I mean, that should be doable. And there are varieties of this experiment. In one version, they let people keep their cell phones but told them not to use them. And of course they cheated. They used their cell phones. In another version of the experiment, they took away their cell phones, so people had to endure the full 15 minutes by themselves doing absolutely nothing. And they could say that it had taken quite its toll on them. My favorite version of the experiment is one in which they gave the participants an electric shock before the experiment started. Not dangerous, but painful, and said to them that, well, if you like, just to break the monotony of this situation, you can give yourself an electric shock. And a surprisingly large number of people chose to administer electric shocks to themselves. One person did something like, I think it was like 100 shocks in 15 minutes, but that guy must have liked it. And then we might say, well, what does that experiment show us? Is it an experiment that shows an incapacity for dealing with boredom or with loneliness? And it's hard to say, but what it does show us is an incapacity to fill yourself by yourself, an incapacity to draw on your own resources in dealing with the situation you're in. And I think, yeah, we have something to learn there.
We will not have time to speak all about topics that you are talking, writing in your books about, but maybe we can connect fear, freedom, and lying. Those are the topics that are really connected in an interesting way. Because when in fear we don't have freedom. In freedom we used to lie a lot. Without freedom we used to lie a lot, and then we are again in the fear. And maybe you can explain a little bit all those phenomena in a short way, of course, that you're interested in, because they're really interesting for us also as normal readers, not philosophers. We all feel this. We feel fear. We feel that we are not free. We feel that we lie too much every day. That politicians are lying to us.
Yeah. Well, if we start with fear, I mean that book argues that, as have other social scientists said, that we're living in a culture of fear. Now, what do we mean by that? It means that fear has become a sort of cultural prism through which we evaluate all sorts of phenomena. And it's striking how the future at some point changed from being a promise to being a threat. Something that you had to, in a way, avoid. At most, you could stop things from going to hell. Fear has an impact on... Fear certainly has an impact on your freedom, because it provides... One thing is that you will introduce a lot of safety measures. And you will have a demand for increased safety. And you will never reach any sort of limit. You can always ask for more. And all those safety measures will have a freedom cost. It will hinder will be a hindrance to our ability to act freely. But in another sense, it also undermines our freedom, because it creates a norm of cautiousness in which we constantly have to think about what to do. And this was also quite striking during the pandemic. All of a sudden, lots of these things that we did in our everyday without thinking about them, all of a sudden we had to become cautious. We had to wash our hands, wear our masks, all these things that undermine our, let's say, spontaneity in everyday life, which is a crucial part of our freedom. Yeah, so that was fear. And then I should move on to freedom.
A little bit of freedom, and then a little bit on lying, so we can
Well, what do I mean by freedom? I'd say, if I were to try to give us as uncontroversial an account of what freedom means as possible, it would probably say that freedom is the capacity to choose to live one sort of life rather than another. I said most people would agree with that sort of minimal definition. But that has many dimensions. Going from the metaphysical aspects, is freedom even possible in a world in which we believe that there are such things as natural laws? And I answer a conditional yes in my book. And then we move on to, well, if such freedom is possible, if humans have this capacity for free agency, for choosing one sort of life rather than another, what sort of society should we construct? And my answer is probably not very surprising. I say liberal democracy is probably one of the most brilliant ideas since humanity stood up. It's sort of the new kid on the block in political theories, but liberal democracy give people greater possibility for making those choices, for living one sort of life rather than another. Or the fundamental idea is that individuals or groups should, to the greatest possible extent, be allowed to live their lives according to what they themselves believe provides their lives with meaning and value. So, but then you have the political framework. And when you establish that political framework, the next question is, well, what should you use your freedom for? And then you really come down to the question, what do you care about? Because freedom is ultimately about realizing values in your life, and then you have to ask yourself, well, what are my deepest commitments? What are my real values here? And I say in the book that if you manage to answer that question about what you truly care about, and you also get that to match up with what you think you should care about, and you manage to put that into practice, into how you live, then you have as much freedom and life meaning as you could realistically hope for. So, yeah, that was a crash course in freedom.
Freedom in few sentences, like it is like Instagram freedom. It's great. We understand it completely nowadays.
And then lying. Well, I wrote the book on lying partly because I had done quite a lot of work on truth. And then I thought it would be interesting to go deeper into lying. But lying is also connected to freedom in the sense that if I lie to you, I'm depriving you of freedom. If I manage to lie successfully to you, I'm really removing power from you and transporting it to me, because your perceptions, your ideas of what to do, how to do it, and so on, will be guided by my will rather than reality itself. So lying is really a form of coercion, and which is the main reason also why it's morally wrong, because you fail to respect other people's right to give shape to their own lives, which is pretty fundamental to what we take by being human life, human dignity, and so on. So lying in that sense, it's a pretty grave violation. Nevertheless, it may be necessary.
You mentioned truth, but what is truth now? What is truth in the era of post-truth? And what is post-truth? The word, Oxford word in, I don't know, a few years ago, it was the word of the year.
Yeah.
Actually, we don't understand it completely, what it is.
Of course, philosophers have attempted for a few thousand years to give a good account of what we mean by truth, and pretty much failed so far. But the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, in 1938, he did this empirical study of truth, in which he went around and asked housewives in Oslo, what is truth? And their most common reply was, something is truth if that's the way it is. Which I think is a perfectly sensible reply, pretty close to Aristotle. But and I think that's, for our everyday practical purposes, it really does the job for what we need. But what I then say is that what matters really isn't truth. but truthfulness. Because truth is evidence transcendent. It's always beyond the reasons we can give for something being true. You cannot control truth, and that's why truth can be truth. It's resistant to power and so on. But what you can control is truthfulness, being truthful. And British philosopher Bernard Williams has argued that truthfulness has two virtues. The first is sincerity. You should say what you believe is the case. And the other virtue is accuracy. You should make sure that what you believe is the case is actually the case. And you can fail to be truthful in three different ways. You can lie. In that sense, you're insincere, so we break that rule. You can just say a lot of bullshit. And bullshit is characterized by not caring whether or not something is true. So you're in that sense, you're also insincere because you're pretending to be playing a game in which truth matters, but it really doesn't matter to you. You're just aiming for effects. But you can also fail truthfulness by resorting to what I call, Stephen Colbert, the American comedian, he called it truthiness. And I had to invent a new Norwegian word for it when I wrote my book, which I called sannaktighet, which would describe something that looks a bit like truth but isn't quite truth. And there you are sincere. You say what you believe is the case, but you really go by your gut feeling. You haven't made sure that what you believe is the case is actually the case. And I believe that my Croatian translator had some challenges here.
I hope Misha will now come here, because in Croatian language he also invented a word istiništavnost, and actually we are now in the field of language, in linguistics, because when you mentioned all those words, it is a matter of lying and truth through language, and to all those not just terms to describe this, but also to use language to lie and to say truth and to be. So please, Misha, come here. I would like to ask you a little bit about translations. Evo, Miša će nam samo malo pojasniti, može čak i na hrvatskom za uvod, kako je preveo knjigu o filozofiji laži, slojeve jezika i slojeve istinitosti i laži koje zapravo o kojima Lars piše. Sjećam.
Da, ovo mi je, ne znam, 5. ili 6. Larsova knjiga koju sam preveo, ali zapravo bila daleko najzahtjevnija, upravo zbog tih riječi s kojima se zapravo treba pozabaviti i prilagoditi ih našem jeziku. Dakle, Lars kaže da mora izmisliti, skovati novu riječ za taj truthiness, pojam koji postoji u engleskom jeziku još u 16. stoljeća, ali nekako izašao iz uporabe i vratio ga je Stephen Colbert zapravo u doba Trumpa, koji je zapravo izvrtao istinu kako je god htio, odnosno nije mario za istinu. Pa sam dakle tu morao izmisliti tu istiništavnost, zapravo tu istinu koju netko predstavlja kao istinu, ali ona je stvari ništavna, dakle nema nikakvu vrijednost, to nije zaista istina. Tu zapravo ovoga sam se kao prevoditelj susreo sa određenim filozofskim problemom, jer prevođenje je također pitanje točnosti, iskrenosti i vjernosti. Postojala jedna stara krilatica, vrlo šovinistička, da je prijevod poput žene, ako je lijep nije vjeran, ako je vjeran nije lijep. Dakle, danas je feministička studija naročito voli isticati kako je to bilo šovinističko ozračje u prevođenju 19. stoljeća, ali vjerovalo se to, dakle, ako prevedete točno, odnosno vjerno originalu, onda taj prijevod neće na vašem jeziku, na ciljanom jeziku biti lijep, neće dobro zvučati. Ako se date slobodu, onda ste odstupili od onog što je napisao autor i stoga ste iznevjerili njega. Tako da prevoditelj mora biti onaj zapravo, Talijani kažu tradutore, prevoditelj izdajnik koji zapravo mora birati koga će izdati u kojoj mjeri.
Htjela bi još samo da nam daš bullshitting i muljanje. Aha, evo, još da nam samo pojasni malo, je bilo tu različitih riječi bullshitting koji mi zapravo nemamo u prijevodu, pa si ga ti prevao i kao muljanje. Bilo je tu još nekakvih termina? o sjećanju.
Da, sad se više ne sjećam točno, prošlo je 1 godinu dana prevoda te knjige. Taj bullshit je zapravo jako nezgodan termin. U engleskom ima veći semantički dijapazon nego što ima jedna riječ u hrvatskom. Odlučio sam se dakle ipak da ne idem opisno, nego da koristim tu jednu riječ muljanje, budući da se uglavnom odnosilo na Trumpa, a on je onako nekako postao sinonim upravo za muljanje. Duše u jednom drugom prijevodu jednog nizozemskog sociologa Rutgera Bregmana, on je govorio o bullshit jobs, pa sam tamo preveo to ovako dosta grubim terminom prodavanje muda pod bubrege, što bi također možda u tom kontekstu jednako dobro moglo proći.
Hvala ti puno. Thank you, Misha, and thank you, Lars.
And I couldn't agree more.
I will translate you later.
But you
you
said,
understood a little bit.
yeah, but you said that you don't have a word for bullshit in Croatian.
Yeah.
Well, I originally tried to introduce a Norwegian word for bullshit, which makes sense to a lot of you, but it's pisspreik, which would be the proper Norwegian translation of bullshit. But but nobody else would accept it, so I was stuck with using the English term. So I'm very glad that you had the Croatian term for this.
Yeah, and that we have Misha also, because he's really like a creative translator, and he told us about how the responsibility of translating, because we never really can understand other language completely. So who are your translators to English? How you manage it? Because you are talking in English about your books.
Yeah.
You know, so you have to translate yourself sometimes.
Yeah, I do. But actually, I write most of my books in Norwegian. I could probably do them in English. For instance, the book on work, that was originally written in English, not in Norwegian. But of course, it's my native language. It's the language that I grew up in. It's the language that I have the greatest repertoire in. So I prefer to primarily write in this tiny language that very few people command. And one of the miracles, and that's only possible because of people such as Misha, is of course that I can sit in Norway and write these books in Norwegian, and then I have readers all around the world, which is absolutely fantastic.
Do you think that boundaries of our language are boundaries of our world, and that we actually can't understand really each other if we are not in the same language? As a philosopher, I'm asking you. This is a linguistic philosophical Wittgenstein question.
Yeah, of course. I mean, different languages will cut up the world in different ways. Nevertheless, if we are to communicate at all, I must assume that the majority of what you're saying is in fact true. That our realities do, for the main part, match up. Only then is communication possible. And this is, of course, another area where truth becomes so important, because it becomes corrosive. It undermines that common reality. And I think that America today, the US, is a country which, even though they speak the same language, they, to an increasing extent, do not relate to the same world. Already in the elections in 2016, 4 out of 5 Republican voters said that they would not be able to agree with Democratic voters on basic facts. Not basic values, but basic facts. And Democratic voters said the same about Republicans. Then we have a huge problem, because then we have really tribal epistemology. And to an increasing extent, I see the US as a neo-tribal society in which these two large chunks of the population really look at two different worlds, two different realities. And if we're not, to a great extent, talking about the same world, then all possibility of genuine democratic conversation is broken down. So I think that we've actually just seen the beginning of the problems in the US, and unless something dramatic happens that turns the tide.
I would like you to explain a little bit how process of everyday life and everyday horrors, for example, war now in Europe, how they affect your work. How do you start to think about topics of your interests in everyday life, in everyday problems? What are you writing right now?
Yeah, I usually write a book because there's something I fail to understand. I mean, I never write books about things I believe I understand. Why should I? For me, writing a book is always a process of discovery, of trying to figure out something that I cannot fully grasp. And that will, to a great extent, be dictated by what happens in the world at the moment. And I was now originally writing a short book on political philosophy and political legitimacy. But then on February 24th, with the invasion, I thought, man, it really got dark out there now. And then I left that book to the side and started writing a book on hope, the philosophy of hope. Because it seemed that topic was more acute, trying to figure what is hope? How should we hope? What's the difference between good hope and bad hope, and so on? So I tried to figure that out. And apart from that, I always write my books in exactly the same way. First, I usually do an awful lot of research. And as you may have noticed, there tend to be fairly long bibliographies at the end of my books. And then I do research. I read and I read and I read, and I don't write anything. And then suddenly it dawns on me, okay, so that's the way it is. Then I get the book I'm supposed to write, and then I start writing. Then I very often go to my cabin with my dog because I need someone to talk to every now and then I just write and write and write, and the writing is done very quickly usually. And I always write the first draft by hand, always by hand. When I've done that, I type it into my computer, I throw away approximately 1/3, and then it's done. It's always like that. That's my way of working. So yeah. So, but for a very long time, it seems like I'm doing absolutely nothing. And then all of a sudden, it seems like I'm doing a lot. Yeah.
And who are the thinkers and philosophers that you are reading right now? Think about hope. Who are the guides through this topic for you?
Of course, I do look at the old Greeks who were very skeptical of hope to a great extent. And you know, the myth of Pandora, what's the one thing that's left in the jar? That's elpis, so that's hope. So of course Aristotle and so on. But an interesting figure here is Spinoza, who in his ethics really encourages us to get rid of all hope. Hope is irrational. You should not be guided by hope, and so on. That's in his ethics. But then when it turns to political philosophy, he says that the only viable foundation for any democracy is hope. You cannot build a society on fear if you are to have free citizens. So there, hope is reintroduced because he understands that not all humans are these sages who come to a fully rational understanding of everything. So hope becomes absolutely essential for maintaining a democratic state, and I think he's right. So that's also part of this project here. For a long time, we've been guided by what is often called a liberalism of fear. What should we avoid? But I think that we also need to change our perspective somewhat and ask ourselves, what should we hope for? And the important kind of hope is the sort of hope that does not encourage you to just lean back and see what happened and hopefully everything will turn out right. I mean, the constructive hope is the sort of hope that opens up new venues for agency. It shows you possibilities, something to aim for. It's a sort of active hope. that's where we should be heading. So, but I'm in the middle of this now, so I haven't thought it fully through.
But are your books helping you to live better and happier life? Because you have all those things and all those researches that we are not having.
Actually, I think so.
So you think you're happier than us here?
No, I think I'm happier than I used to be.
They are helping. Actually,
Which is something. Yeah, because it gains some sort of clarity. And of course, it's a very common cliche that in order to be profound, you have to be depressed. Usually, I think that's self-flattery from depressed people. But it's a very old stereotype. And of course, you find it in Ecclesiastic in the Old Testament, where there is much wisdom, there is much despair. You find it in the pseudo-Aristotelian writings. You find it in Ficino and such writers. You find it in Nietzsche. You find it in the Norwegian Håvamål even, where one of the traditional Norwegian texts, which it says that a man shouldn't be fully wise. The heart is seldom light if you're completely wise, and so on. So the idea there is always that in order to be wise, you should be depressed. I think that's bullshit. I think that there I'm more in line with Spinoza. That really, wisdom also consists in trying to bring about a happier life. And I think that, well, I've had moderate success in my own case, but I can't make other people happy, and I think that's also a crucial aspect of doing philosophy. I cannot think for others. What I can do when I write a book, I can say that this way of thinking about this is not very helpful because this and that. And I say, going down this venue is more promising. But there's always a large chunk of work left for the reader. The reader has to complete the book by themselves, because philosophy is ultimately about self-reflection. And self-reflection cannot be outsourced to me or anybody else. Every single reader has to complete that by themselves.
So I will ask you one personal question. What is your biggest fear?
Simply that the people I care most about is seriously harmed. I mean, that is my biggest fear on a personal level. Of course, there's lots to worry about in this world. But even now, even with what is happening very close to here, for the most part, human life has never been better or safer for a larger part of humanity. And I would say that if you could choose a point in time to be born into this world, from the dawn of man and up until today, you would be an idiot not to choose today.
Yeah, I agree completely. Ima li neko pitanje možda iz publike? Ili da nastavimo još malo? Ne bih htjela okupirati vrijeme. I asked if there is a question, but I would like to just skip a little bit on fashion, because this is a topic also very nice. Prada, Prada, Prada. Actually, as is one quote in your book. So, what about fashion during past years? Actually, we also change our shopping habits, maybe even, I don't know, maybe even masks that we are putting on through clothes.
Yeah, and a lot of online shopping during those last years, but also a lot of tracksuits and
and unglamorous Zoom conversation, you know, in slippers, without perfume. Yeah, it is really not fashionable.
Has perhaps not been the peak of our appearance in the last couple of years, but sometimes people ask me, why on earth did you write the book on the philosophy of fashion? And the reason is simply, I had written a book on evil, and I thought, what's the topic I could choose that would be the most remote from this really depressing thing I devoted several years to? And I thought, yeah, fashion is probably it. So plus fashion is important, because it permeates so much. And then I'm not talking about fashion primarily in terms of clothing, but fashion as a social logic, fashion as the constant craving for novelty, fashion as the constant replacing, fashion as what Walter Benjamin, the German theorist, called the eternal recurrence of the new. And it goes into so many activities. I mean, politics, for instance, you should have something new to bring to the table in order to be interesting. Perfectly sound policy that has worked for quite long is not sufficient. Even in philosophy, we would talk about which topics are sexy and which topics are unsexy and so on. So, I mean, there are fashions in philosophy too. So this social logic was interesting to try to figure out.
And actually, it is a part of anthropology, sociology, sociology, and everyday life and pop culture and all those new world phenomena. I think it is a part of us, even we think that we don't care, but actually we care. All of us, you know, we have masks now.
Of course we do.
Yeah. And what about evil? I didn't want to speak about it because I think it's too much evil nowadays in media. But okay, we can pass through this book also a little bit because it's really hard and it's it's a heavy book, heavy topic.
Yeah, I mean that.
Now actually now it's even heavier when you read it again.
Yeah, I mean, writing that book really took me down to the basement. I mean, that was a really depressing book to write, which is why I needed something lighter afterwards. But really, what do we mean by evil? Because sometimes people say, why do you use such an outdated notion as evil? And I think we need that notion because it's part of our moral framework. We have this axis of value in us, with a positive side and a negative side. And evil is the term we use for the very outer parts of the negative side. The sort of actions in which a word like immoral simply would not cover it. For instance, if we look at Anders Behring Breivik, killed all those young people at Utøya in Norway, 2011, if we look at Srebrenica, if we look at the Twin Towers and so on, it's simply, if you call those things immoral, you fail to capture the sheer horror of what happened. So I think that it's a concept that helps us in our orientation towards the world. But I also think that we often tend to misunderstand evil, and we misunderstand evil agents. Evil agents typically do what they do for a large number of reasons. I don't think anybody does evil simply because it's evil. I think that's pure myth. But some do it out of self-interest because they wish to achieve something. The most dangerous agents are the idealists, performing idealistic evil. They do something evil, believing that they're doing something good, believing that they have justice on their side, and whatever they choose to do, it will be morally justified because they see themselves as fighting against some evil, like fighting against so-called neo-Nazi junkies in Kiev. And then you have what I call stupid evil, which is simply a failure of moral reflection. For instance, you sit in an office, you make decisions that have extremely grave consequences for others, but you simply do your job as a perfectly normal bureaucrat or something. So I think that we have to be open to the fact that there are varieties of evil here in trying to understand this phenomenon.
But is there, as the pop band and the National says, a little bit of hell in everyone? In one verse, they have a song about this. Is there a little bit of hell in everyone?
Yeah.
Is the evil in every of us?
I mean, purely good and purely evil people, I mean, they belong in works of fiction. We're all somewhere in between, but we're not in the same place in between. Some are clearly worse, some are clearly better. But all humans are at bottom, as well as on surface, good and evil. And saying that someone is good deep down inside, doesn't help much. What's important is really how you are on the surface. What you actually do to others, that's what counts.
What do you do? That is the most important, not what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But we will continue a little bit just in one maybe shiny, happy and positive and optimistic way to finish this conversation. How to stay cool and normal in this crazy crisis, in those times, in this our world, in this month ahead. Do you have any suggestion? Anything, how to be normal in this world now?
Yeah. Normal and calm aren't necessarily the same thing. I think being normal can also mean to be terribly upset, to be enraged that something is happening and saying that this is simply not acceptable. That can be normal. That would be the normal and proper reaction in so many cases. But I mean, trying to keep our heads cool and our hearts warm. I mean, that's really the way to go about. And also try to maneuver yourself in this. I mean, we live in a difficult media reality, bombarded by all sorts of spin, bullshit, falsities and so on, and really trying to figure out where you should place your trust. That's really the big challenge these days. Who should you trust? And I'd say that the average YouTuber is not the answer. And you should also not confuse Facebook with the real world. If we look at the people who are the most active on Facebook, it's typically the political fringes who occupy far greater space on social media than their real numbers account for. So the world isn't quite as insane as you could be led to believe by going through your Facebook feed.
That's a good advice. Thank you very much. Evo, zahvalimo jednim pljeskom Larsu, hvala što je došao. Hvala i još jednom Buksi, hvala svima vama naravno. Lars je tu još neko vrijeme, potpisivat će knjige, družit će se s vama. Ja predlažem da svi koji imate želju, popričajte još s njim malo, popričajte, iskoristite to i tako, vidimo se ponovno. Hvala i Tim Presu još jednom.